Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Fernand Webb. I am the director of the CSR Institute here at Toronto Metropolitan University, as well as a professor here, and it is my pleasure to moderate and participate in this session concerning countering Trump 2.0. What role can bottom-up global coalitions play? For those of you who are joining for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are making a return engagement, welcome back. As with all of these sessions, they are co-sponsored by some excellent student organizations here at Toronto Metropolitan University. If we could turn to the next slide, please. So Toronto Metropolitan University is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. What excellent principles: peace, friendship, and respect. ISO 26000 social responsibility. This standard, which is a non-state global standard, does many things, but one of the things it does is it defines social responsibility. So being that we are the Corporate Social Responsibility Institute, you can see here that it's all about how an organization addresses its impacts of its decisions and activities on both society and the environment, doing it in a transparent and ethical way, contributing to sustainable development, taking into account the expectations of stakeholders, not just shareholders being only one example of a stakeholder, in compliance with applicable law, key concept we'll be talking about here, but also consistent with international norms of behavior, equally important. Not only integrating it within the organization, but also practicing it in its relations with others. Next slide, please. The other animating concept for all Toronto Metropolitan University CSR Institute sessions is the concept of sustainable governance, which is this idea that in the 21st century, with this sort of complex, fast, evolving, multi-jurisdictional environmental, social, and economic challenges, really the only way we can effectively address them is by harnessing the unique energies and capabilities of all three, of government, the private sector, and civil society, using a combination of rule instruments. So rule instruments encompasses, yes, laws, but also things like standards, principles, and so on. Processes of rulemaking, processes of rule adjudication. Again, we think of the state-based ones, but there are also many different processes for rulemaking and rule adjudication that go beyond the state. Institutions, again, we tend to think of institutions as being government-based or intergovernmental-based, and they are, of course, critically important. But we're also talking about institutions which emanate from non-state sources. And actors encompasses all three, of government, the private sector, and civil society, domestically and at the international level. Oftentimes in sustainable governance, there is a collaboration among different instruments, institutions, processes, and actors, but also there's oftentimes some very useful friction or rivalrous check and balance type behavior, which is also very useful in getting innovation of one sort or another. Next slide, please. All of the CSR Institute sessions are hosted by the CSR Institute, and you can access them on the CSR Institute webpage. We have regular events coming up. Contact me at the email there below, and I will put you on the email list for upcoming events. Toronto Metropolitan University has a bit of a reputation for this sort of activity. Next slide, please. We have, initially we had planned to have 4 speakers. Unfortunately, Isabella pulled out at noon. Pulling out is a bit of a joke there because unfortunately she's engaging in dental surgery. So she really is pulling out. And so she just, at the last second, was not able to make it. We're very apologetic of that because much looking forward to her unique insights, as you can see here. I've highlighted the fact that she's involved in some specific rule of law initiatives, and so very much was looking forward to getting her input. But hopefully we'll have her for a future event. Next slide, please. We're also very pleased to have Toby Mendel here. And as you can see, Toby is the director and founder of the Center for Law and Democracy, which is a civil society entity. But he's also the chair and president of Transparency International Canada. Transparency International being a global international non-governmental organization with chapters around the world, including in Canada. And you can see he's also been involved in Article 19, a human rights NGO, in a very central role. Was involved with Oxfam International, Oxfam, part of Oxfam Canada, part of Oxfam International, again, a global non-governmental organization. I've highlighted those parts because here we are speaking specifically about the role of non-state entities. So I just wanted to draw particular attention to the non-state activity that Toby has played key roles in, and therefore I'm sure is going to have some very interesting insights in that regard. Next slide, please. Bennett is a return speaker here several times, particularly recently, particularly in light of the key issue here, which is the activity of the Republican administration, and in particular personified in Trump. But to the point here, Bennett has got experience in the private sector with respect to the Calvert funds, but also heavily involved in government in the Clinton administration, and again highlighting that he's been involved in the development of a number of different coalitions and non-state coalitions of one sort or another. And again, that being really the focus of this particular session, I wanted to make sure that I highlighted those parts, and looking forward to hearing Bennett's insights in that regard. If you could turn to the next slide, please, Luke. In terms of myself, again, yes, I'm just another academic, but I also am one of those academics who is directly involved both in the development of laws and also in the development of non-state standards, such as the ISO 26000 standard. ISO is a non-state international body bringing together governments, private sector, civil society, and that certainly was the case for ISO 26000. But I've also been involved chairing and otherwise convening various different international and domestic standards of the non-state variety. So next slide, please. We do have people patching in from around the world. My particular thanks to those of you who are patching in from outside Canada and United States and Latin America and South America, because you are in different time zones, and props to you for patching in at oddball times of the day and or evening. So with respect to all of you, if you do have particular points that you want to make, if you can email me, I'll do my best to fold those into this particular session. Next slide, please, Luke. So a roadmap for this session. I'm going to quickly go through a diagnostic, as they say in France, a diagnostic of the situation. Then we're going to turn to the basic proposition. I'm going to have a bit of a disclaimer, quick overview of terms so that we're all on the same page in that regard. And then we'll actually begin the tour de table. So in terms of the diagnostic of the situation, there's a metaphor that I like to use, which is the airline cockpit. What I would suggest is that what we have is one particular actor, and that being Trump, who's come to the front of the plane. He's entered into the cockpit, and he has taken over the cockpit controls. Now, in a normal democracy, there are guardians of every, if you could call them that, cockpit instrument. So you just don't have somebody who comes up from the back side of the plane and jerks things around. But that's exactly what Trump is doing. He's grabbing hold of the tariff instrument. He's grabbing hold of various different economic and legal instruments in United States and to some extent at the global order, and he's jerking them around and he's jerking the passengers around. There's a great deal of movement among those passengers. We're being thrown this way and that way. I would go so far as to suggest that he enjoys doing that jerking around. But the more important point is that the normal guardians of each of those instruments, he is in the process of taking those guardians out. And so you see a great deal of destruction of that in United States so that the normal checks and balances are not there. And he's withdrawing from many international institutions of one sort or another and instruments, treaties, and so on. And so what that means is that he's unbridled. He's largely unbridled. And this is highly problematic. And this brings up this second metaphor, the emerging global king rule by fiat. And what I'm getting at is Trump is right now making announcements through social media that are throwing the global marketplace into turmoil and individual countries into turmoil. He's dressing down, leaders of particular countries and so on. And he's showing that we have this effectively a new way of governing at both the international way and at the domestic way. It's highly problematic, in my opinion, but essentially he's doing things by social media. Now, behind the social media is a certain amount of actual structure in United States and so on, but he's in the process of remaking that so that it really is coming from his mind at 3 a.m. He decides he doesn't like what somebody has said somewhere, and he's making an announcement, and it's having an immediate impact. And we have to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, that that is what is happening right now. And it could get a lot worse before it gets a lot better. I'll just point out that in this global cockpit, there is another button there, and it's called the nuclear button. And I'm afraid we have a very reckless actor, and that the guardians around that button are in the process of being basically diminished, if not removed. And in a fit of pettiness, I'm afraid he's more than capable of touching that button as he is all of these other buttons that he's touching on right now. So the basic proposition is that global grassroots coalitions of one sort or another, both market-based, for example, aligned boycotts, and non-market-based, for example, a global coalition supportive of the rule of law and the international rule-based order, have got some distinctive characteristics. Some of them are positive in the sense of they're less assailable by Trump actions than Trump is very capable of responding directly to states. And within United States, he's also making direct actions against law firms and universities and so on. But a coalition of actors, which are non-state, is capable of performatively demonstrating that there is opposition, and that opposition is less susceptible to direct counteractions by Trump than are the states that he is variously imposing punishments at right now, and indeed individual law firms or universities are. So a alignment of actors, both within the United States and beyond the United States, that stands up and says, what you're doing is wrong, and you should know that they are wrong. And this is a global coalition all saying it's wrong with membership across the world. I'm not thinking, I don't think anyone is thinking that this is going to stop Trump and his allies from behaving the way they're doing, but it's a way of bringing together actors that are currently attempting to respond individually, such as Harvard University responding individually, or a law firm bringing a counter lawsuit against Trump. And if there is a backdrop of, for example, the legal profession around the world expressing their opposition to what it is Trump is doing. And there is a backdrop of consumers around the world and investors around the world and businesses around the world that are all expressing their disagreement with his approaches. I'm suggesting that these are just part of a possible renewed response to Trump that is less vulnerable to immediate attack than some of the actors that are currently attempting to respond individually. So just to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that boycotts or global coalitions of any sort are a panacea, and these particular ones are just examples. So please do not think that they are in any way. I'm suggesting that these will be the answer. They are just propositions to be explored here. Also, we're going to need to define terms, and I'm going to do that in a second. And then finally, we can get to insights and observations from our superb guests. So quickly turning now to definitions, if you can turn beyond that slide. Next slide, please. So a definition of a coalition, it's a structured or semi-structured alliance of diverse actors. As you can see there, common features that they have: common purpose, voluntary association, diversity of membership, some sort of coordination, and autonomy of members. So that's a quick definition of coalition. Turning to the next slide, please. A definition of boycott: collective coordinated action by consumers, investors, businesses, etc., to engage economically with a specific entity. Common elements: purposeful non-engagement. By non-engagement, I think what we're talking about here is deliberate market-based action of one sort or another. They have identified motivation. They are engaging in collective action. There's cross-border participation, and there's a targeted entity. Next slide, please. Rule of law, as understood here, and this is, again, our speakers here can disagree and amplify and elaborate in any way they want to anything that I'm saying here. And I'm not in any way wanting to box them in, but just to start things off, defining rule of law as a foundational legal and political principle, stating that all individuals, institutions, and government actors are accountable in laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights standards. And again, you can see some key characteristics. And again, my point here is to indicate that what we're seeing is an erosion from those things taking place both domestically and at the international level right now. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide: international rules-based order. It refers to an international framework in which states and other actors are expected to conduct their affairs according to agreed upon norms, etc. Key characteristics: a normative system, both legal agreements and soft norms, institutionally mediated, geopolitically contested. It's more political than legal. Okay, so I just wanted to lay those points out on the table before we turn to our speakers. I'm simultaneously a moderator and a speaker, but I'll be shutting up now largely. You can leave that one off for now. And that just stop the slides there. Thanks, Luke. We will turn first to Toby for his immediate insights and observations. Let me emphasize, he's in no way bound to follow anything that I've said so far. This is his opportunity to just provide his insights as a experienced actor with respect to the non-state actors generally. Over to you, Toby.
Well, thanks so much. As a lifelong campaigner for free speech, there was no way you were going to box me in, so I don't worry too much about that. And I have to say, I love that cockpit analogy. So I've been asked to speak for about 7 minutes, so I will try to keep quite close to that. And rather than kind of building a major theme here, I'm going to more make a bunch of staccato points just to get some ideas out there, because I think, this is a large and multifaceted topic, and I just want to kind of throw some thoughts out there. So firstly, for me, there's the two different ideas, or they're related, obviously, but the boycott idea and the rule of law one. And on the boycott, I think firstly, we have to be very careful in our information sources not to be trapped in a bubble. And normally when we talk about a bubble, we're kind of talking about a social media bubble, and there's been a lot of literature about the impact of those and the way that those work. But I think that we are also at risk of being in a media bubble, and I distinguish very carefully between media and social media. And just to give an example of this, I was trying to find out some hard stats on the drop in consumer buying from the United States, in reaction to the moves by Trump or the Trump administration. And I really only found, I didn't spend a ton of time, but I really only found one main piece of information about that. And Empire Corporation had, issued a statement saying that there was a steep decline in purchases from the United States. They historically sourced 12% of their products from the United States. They didn't have any information about what had gone, what the steep decline represented. And I went through 3 pages of Google hits, and almost everything was just about this steep decline, nothing from any other company. Now, I'm not questioning Empire's claim about the steep decline, but it is one single information source, and I think we have to be very, very careful, in dealing with that. We shouldn't assume, without actually having some serious information about this, that things are going on when they may actually not be. Maybe there's a little decline, and then people stop declining after they get bored of not having asparagus from the United States after a week or so. I think we need to, be very careful to keep on the facts. Boycotts are not easy things to organize. My history on organizing boycotts goes back to the boycott of South Africa, in the 70s and 80s, I was a student activist at the time, and the students were very engaged on this, but it was not that easy to actually get effective boycotts against South Africa. So they're tough. So we need to be very, very strategic, and we need those boycotts to be sustained. It is irrelevant if Canadian consumers stop buying American grocery products for a few weeks or a few months, but then go back after they get bored with not having asparagus, as I said before. So sustainability is key to this. And, I'm being very hard-nosed and realistic about that, but I think we need to be. And I just skipping out a little bit, going back to Canagan's point, absolutely, we don't need this to be the killer, what's the term I'm looking for? The
Killer app.
The killer app or whatever. We need a very broad-based set of reactions to these unreasonable measures that are coming out of the Trump administration, and this can count itself alongside many, many others, but still, if it's going to be relevant, it needs to be somewhat effective. It strikes me that travel, where I saw much more precise statistics, and the statistics are fairly dramatic, seems a very strategic area of engagement for a boycott. Everybody feels good when they go to the grocery store and they skip over the American asparagus, but not going to the US for a holiday. And I think that that's something that is realistic to maintain over time. There's a lot of contributing factors, which I won't go into detail about to save time, but people are not going to the United States for a for a variety of reasons. They can refocus on Canada or other countries easily enough. And I suppose the hit to the American economy from that is quite a lot. If you don't take a trip to the United States, that counts up a lot of asparagus that you didn't buy. So I think that seems to be, seems to me a propitious area. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but I also suppose that Canadian investment in the United States, which probably almost every Canadian has some of through a pension plan or some other vehicle, is a hugely important potential area for boycott. Probably much more significant than the asparagus point. I haven't seen much talk about organizing anything in that area. I did a search online and really didn't come up with anything on that either. I mean, that's a tough sell if markets in the US are doing well, because ultimately people want their investments to produce strong returns. And if the returns are in the United States, as they have been very strongly over the last few years, for example, it's going to be difficult to convince Canadians or other international partners to forego those returns. But that seems to me to be a potential area for boycott that needs to be involved more. I will say, I mean, I have been involved in a lot of campaigns and a lot of coalitions at the civil society level. And what we're seeing so far is mostly essentially individually driven behavior, including, companies doing things as individual actors, and like labeling and not buying products and things like that. And I would just point out, I mean, there's a lot of details that we can get into on this, but it is going to require an enormous amount of leadership, vision, and ultimately money to organize an effective campaign, to go beyond kind of everybody's outrage and I'm not buying that stuff, to actually coordinate something and to G up the effect of that by having coordinated actions and focusing on, the most effective pressure points and that sort of thing. And doing that even within Canada is going to be a huge challenge. Doing it multi-jurisdictionally, globally is going to be, far more significant as a challenge. Happy to talk about that a little bit more later if people have questions or we get into a discussion about it. Just quickly on the rule of law, because I feel that as a human rights activist, a lifelong human rights activist, obviously I strongly support the rule of law, and I'm very conscious of the attack on the rule of law that's taken place to the south of the border. I think we should understand that although the international rules-based order is also suffering a hit, CUSMA has been effectively thrown aside, and a lot of serious commentary that there's absolutely no justification for the measures that are being put in place based on CUSMA and its rules, and I think that's a fairly solid theory. But the biggest hit to the rule of law by far, of course, is in the United States. So our actions here would be primarily solidarity actions with our American counterparts. That's absolutely fine, but I think we should understand that, of course, the measures that are going on or the actions that are being taken in the United States do have significant international repercussions. So they embolden and enable leaders who want to dispense with the rule of law in their own countries. So it does have a more global implications, but the primary immediate target, I would say, is the United States. Looking at the documents that you provided, Kenrigan, I think to really think seriously about getting something organized going with that target to bolster the rule of law, we would first of all have to have a much clearer set of objectives. Everybody supports the rule of law, but I don't think very many people are going to get engaged in something that's as generic and as broad as that. And then secondly, the event description refers to the idea of speaking to the Trump erosions. I like to speak, and I would like to say a few things to Trump, so I'm motivated by that. But I think if you want to motivate people to get engaged in something like that, we are going to have to think of a much clearer and effective effective set of potential levers for change to get people engaged in something like that. And I also think that to the extent that the focus is on reestablishing or bolstering or protecting or defending the rule of law in the United States, we do need to think a little bit carefully about how, if we're talking about an international coalition that is essentially outside of the United States, and I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking, again, but that's sort of how I understood it, what the kind of the implications of that, or what the optics on that would look like from a U.S. Perspective. Even people within the U.S. who are very concerned about that may not necessarily want foreigners, as we are, telling them how to do their business, as it were. So I think and I've experienced that phenomenon in a lot of the countries I work in. I work almost exclusively internationally, so we need to be thoughtful of that vis-a-vis the U.S. just as we would vis-a-vis other countries. So a lot of slightly random points there, but hopefully some food for thought.
Thanks. Just quickly, with respect to bubbles, one of the things that's interesting about a consumer boycott is it represents action by individuals outside of the bubble, right? Outside of any media bubble. It's individuals behaving that way. And so I hear your point about bubbles, but that's arguably one of the charms of a boycott is it's actually individuals. And if you think of the Biden-Trump debate, it was this key moment when everybody could see he was no longer protected by people in the bubble. Everybody could see he was no longer capable of stringing a sentence together. And that was like a key moment. It pierced the bubble. And similarly, what we're talking about here with these coalitions is that they are unassailable by the media in the normal sense. They can be picked up by the media, but they have an independent capability that's not so controllable by the media, by government, or what have you. Secondly, with respect to the rule of law, imagine if lawyers around the world, I'm just picking one group who arguably have some interest in the rule of law, if they all got together and just said, look, we have our differences, major differences, but what we all agree is that the rule of law is essential for the prosperous, efficient, and fair running of any society anywhere. And we want that on record, that we all stand together with, for example, the law firms and the lawyers of the United States. That's what I'm talking about with respect to this sort of coalition. Obviously, there could be a huge number. I would suggest Transparency International would be a very good candidate to be part of this coalition, given that basically they are concerned with the rule of law. I can't really think of a reason why Transparency International would not be part of this sort of coalition, along with many other non-governmental organizations that have both global and domestic chapters. But over to you, Bennett. I'm
Can I just respond very quickly
yes.
on those 2 points? I mean, I'm going to push back on the bubble idea. I understand that this is a diverse, random coalition of people, but they all believe in one thing, which is the boycott idea. And so they're all prone to fall into the bubble of distortion around that. And I think, I mean, I don't agree with your point there. They lack diversity in their motivation to boycott. Okay. And that's exactly where the informational boycott exists.
We'll leave it at that.
I think that's, I mean, I think, this idea, we're not going to get all of the lawyers in the world, but I mean, I think bringing together a powerful group of actors and speaking to Trump, that's not irrelevant, but I think that to have sustain a coalition over time, you're going to need more than just the speaking bit.
Fair enough. Let's not quibble about the word bubble, because I don't think it's central at all to the discussion here today. Over to you, Bennett.
Thank you, Kernahan. It's a pleasure to join you and Toby. And I'm very sorry that my friend Isabella couldn't join us at the last moment. Was looking forward to her point of view as well. And I really do appreciate Canadian friends' deep concern over the situation with the United States in the last several months, and just given how close we have been as security allies and trading partners, and how intertwined our economies and really our societies have been. Just deeply appreciate your focus here. I want to just start by being clear about the scope and the intensity and the severity of Trump's attack on constitutional democracy and the rule of law. And just to sort of hit the points, and we've already made some of them, but just to put them all together in a kind of staccato list, musing openly about a totally unconstitutional possible third term, issuing pardons for January 6th insurrectionists, including those who were convicted in courts of law of attacking violently law enforcement officers, unleashing an unelected so-called Doge authority led by the wealthiest person on the planet to summarily defenestrate, dismantle whole vital agencies of the US government with global implications from USAID to the National Institutes of Health and so many others, and to summarily terminate the jobs and incomes and livelihoods, if not the careers of dedicated non-political career civil servants and diplomats, defying courts of law. Most recently, just this week, currently, defying clear orders from federal courts to bring back to the United States that one particular individual who was illegally, wrongly transported to that horrific, notorious prison in El Salvador. And then we get to the attacks on the law firms, the universities, and very, very worried about attacks on civil society critics. There's a report out yesterday or today in Politico about deep concern now in the environmental NGO community, in particular in the US, of possible revocations of tax exempt status. And we're seeing that on the university side with the threat reported yesterday against Harvard University. So this is there are other points as well, but the assertion and imposition of unfettered executive power, which frankly has been an objective of conservatives in the Republican Party and in parts of the legal community for decades, has been taken to a level with a ferocity and intensity by this administration that I doubt any, even in the Federalist Society, a decade or two ago would have ever conceived or imagined, let alone supported. This is an all-out attack. So I just wanted to be clear about the contours. And then we get to the question of what we can do. And I so appreciate Kernahan's putting this on the table really as the main focus of our discussion, and in hearing his views as well as Toby's, and I hope others who can join the discussion here in a few minutes. I think we could take some inspiration or at least encouragement from the stand that Harvard University is taking in contrast to Columbia University, and let's hope that other universities rally around. There are some indications that that is happening now, and there's always a strength in numbers. We can also take some encouragement from the stands that some law firms have taken in contrast to Paul Weiss, but some very, very significant ones in the US, Perkins Coie, and others who have refused to buckle to this political intimidation by Trump personally coming out of the Oval Office. I think we can also take some encouragement from the growing number of demonstrations in the streets, and maybe we didn't have the scale and intensity of demonstrations right out of the box in the first few weeks as we did in the first few days after the inauguration in January of 2017, but the hands-off demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and many other cities around the country the weekend before last are indeed encouraging. And I dare say that we're going to see some acts, organized or not, of nonviolent civil disobedience. And those, I think, are to be expected, as the severity and intensity of the attacks on rule of law and basic American institutions no doubt continue here. So when we get to the question of boycott, I do think we have to be careful. I think we have to be realistic about the very limited success that consumer boycotts have had, at least in the US. There have been some that had a little bit of impact, maybe on the likes of Gap and Nike on so-called sweatshop labor 20 to 25 years ago. Certainly, those companies were aware of them. There is this growing boycott of Tesla for obvious reasons in the last couple of months. But I don't think that there's going to be wide-scale consumer boycotts. That said, Canadians shunning American asparagus, even in the spring asparagus season here, is not a bad way to go. And there's also been media reports in the last week about tourism boycotts of the U.S., particularly not just in Canada, but in Europe and elsewhere. And those do send a message because they hit the pocketbook. But let me just end by saying that what we need to hear and see much more of are statements, not just from a few law firms and a few universities, but statements from the legal profession as a whole. We need to hear the American Bar Association even more explicitly, the International Bar Association explicitly. I'm not sure if we've heard from them. They carry some weight. We need to hear from major investors and from corporate America. We have heard from corporate America and from investors in the last couple of weeks, certainly about tariffs. But those criticisms have been confined really to anxiety over the impacts on the markets with all the uncertainty and the further volatility and the spikes in inflation. But what we have not heard from the world of large American multinational corporations or institutional investors are statements that are very clear that this isn't just about haphazard, herky-jerky, volatile economic and trade policies. It's not just about tariffs. It's about the fundamentals of the American economy and the global economy, which rest on rule of law, rest on some semblance of international rules-based order, with the United States playing its historic role as the largest, most stable pillar, despite our many inconsistencies and hypocrisies over the years in our foreign policy and our trade policy. But nonetheless, overall, given our weight as a government, as an economy, we've been the strongest, most stable pillar with all those multiple exceptions. So I think we need to hear and frankly put pressure on corporate America and the world of institutional investors to speak out about the fundamentals. It's pathetic, in my view, that we only hear concerns about tariffs. Those run deep. They have huge implications economically and politically, but we need to hear about the fundamentals here. And I'm sick and tired of big American companies taking for granted the fundamentals of the rule of law and constitutional democracy that have been absolute pillars of their success and the success of the American and global economy for decades. We lose those pillars, we've lost everything.
Absolutely. Luke, and I should mention, everybody can see on their screen, Luke is our wizard here at Toronto Metropolitan University in terms of all the technological aspects. Always eternally grateful to him. Luke, can you put up the slides again just for a second?
Yep, 1 second, Fernand.
And as he does, I'm just going to kind of reiterate a point here. The consumer boycott, which is not just a consumer boycott, it's a boycott by businesses and investors as well. Right now, what's happening around the world is uncoordinated actions by individuals. That's because they do not have a platform. They do not have a way of recognizing that they are part of something greater than that. So that's the first point, is that we all know that the market is a sort of a key way of signaling approval or disapproval. And so the suggestion here is that exactly that a coordinated boycott, perhaps ultimately limited to travel. Indications are that travel to the United States, tourist travel, is way down. And I would suggest it's likely to stay down for quite some time. But it's not coordinated, and there's not recognition that there's actually movement in that effect. So that's the point, is to suggest that there's a market-based way of responding. And we know that Trump responds to markets. For example, bonds, investors in bonds and so on.
Yeah.
That had a major impact on him pulling back on the tariffs. But obviously it doesn't have to be limited to just his economic behavior. It can be also responding to his actions with respect to the Ukraine and so on. So as you see here also, in terms of wording, I've just put together wording of what I thought would be the most simple statement in the sense of, this is something that it doesn't matter whether you're a lawyer in Greece or in Senegal or in the United States or in Canada. This kind of statement of, this is what we all agree on. I can't see why universities wouldn't all agree with that. I can't see why law firms would. And you might say, well, who cares? The reason why I would suggest it matters is because there's an ability to pick you off if you're just one. But there's not an ability to pick you off if you represent a grouping that consists of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So that's the point. And these can be points of departure for more specific actions with respect to specific things that come up, whether it is a erosion of human rights in a particular situation, or it is an attack on a court, or it is whatever. So Americans need to be aware of the fact that there is an impact and there is a solid voicing coming from not just United States, but also from outside United States. And if we just rely on social media, and we just rely on mainstream media, or we just rely on what Trump says, that voice is not heard. So that's the kind of the point behind these two things in particular. So yeah,
just a couple of
Yep.
couple of comments, Ken, again, if I may. I mean, I think that I mean, I like this wording. It's very elegant. I think we do need to train it very directly on the actions of the Trump administration, which it doesn't presently do. We're not talking in the theoretical sense about the rule of law. There are myriad ways in which the rule of law could be improved in any country in the world, even the country with the best rule of law. I mean, I think we need to make it very clear what we're talking about. I mean, just a couple of comments, Bennett. I mean, I understand that those corporate boycotts have not been successful in the United States, and we have similar experience up here. I do think that there is a fundamental difference here. That with the corporate boycotts, you're trying to mobilize against a corporation which is doing something wrong, but then people sort of think, well, all of the corporations are doing something wrong. Why are we picking out this corporation? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's hard to create a strongly motivational case for participating in a corporate boycott unless you're kind of quite invested in the issue that around which the boycott revolves. This one, much less so in terms of that motivational thing, as Kenrigan has pointed out, and as we're seeing, although I don't think we know exactly how significant it is yet. I mean, we have stats on Tesla, but there is a huge individually driven motivation here, quite outside of any organization, which an organizational backdrop would presumably enhance. So I do think we could distinguish this from other the kinds of boycotts which have been much more tailored but also very specific and harder to buy into, I think. Just on the rule of law, and I mean, secondly, I fully endorse your comment, Bennett, about the American companies, and not only American companies. I don't think Canadian companies have come out very strongly either on the principled side of things, more on the economic side of things, and they need to do that, and they should do that. So fully endorse that. I mean, there are examples of countries as an unfortunate way that America could evolve, where although they have absolute failure of the rule of law when it comes to politics and human rights and that sort of thing, have maintained a fairly solid rule of law system when it comes to the business sector. So there was an IBA study like 20 years ago on the rule of law in Malaysia, and the study found that if you had even an economic dispute with the government as a corporation, you could expect reasonably fair, proper rule of law type treatment from the courts. Once you got into the political human rights, that sort of space, then the situation was utterly different. So there are negative scenarios for a rule of law evolvement, which would be amenable or acceptable for business from the point of view of business. And I think I'm not obviously not advocating for that. That's terrible, but I think we do need to be conscious of that possibility, at least when we bite down on the rule of law.
I've got a couple of comments, actually more than a couple of comments, but I'm just going to read out these here. First one, if possible, could you get the speakers today to address the future of labor standards in the supply chains, given Trump administrative policies? This is what I was trying to avoid with that possible wording, is getting down to this particular axe to grind and that particular axe to grind, simply because behind all of those axes to grind is this basic fundamental rule of law point. But yes, for sure. Look at labor standards and supply chains. And then I've got another point here, which is, can you talk about U.S. attempts to use their economic power to roll back human rights? Yeah. So do you have any particular thoughts on that? And Luke, you can take down the possible wording. I just wanted to flash that up to show you that's the sort of thing we're talking about here.
I can quickly do both, being deeply involved in both, and former senior human rights diplomat for the State Department. But just on the first point, international labor standards through company operations and supply chains are going to be eroded the next several years. And I can't emphasize enough the global impacts of the cuts here that we've seen. The International Labor Affairs Bureau of the U.S. Department of Labor is gone. The Solidarity Center, aligned with the AFL-CIO, that's part of the National Endowment for Democracy, is probably gone, but hanging in there valiantly by some threads. And both the iLab people and Solidarity Center, both of whom I've worked with for decades, do tremendously important work around the world, supporting workers' freedom of association, collective bargaining, working against forced labor, discrimination, child labor, the whole panoply of labor rights issues. The knock-on effects that we see to organizations, trade unions, labor rights, human rights organizations funded by USAID, iLab, and who the Solidarity Center work with, are deleterious. I mean, just terrible. In terms of the overall impact on human rights around the world, the U.S. was taken out again by Trump of the UN Human Rights Council, and is broadly disengaging, not withdrawing from, but disengaging from the UN. I think that'll certainly be the case with other human rights bodies and institutions and instruments around the world. And I also fear that there's going to be less human rights focused diplomacy on the part of not only the State Department in Washington, but our embassies and consulates around the world, a couple dozen of which are supposedly slated for closing in the very near term. plus finally the scope of the country reports on human rights, which are the most comprehensive and authoritative annual reports on human rights conditions country by country around the world, at least the most authoritative and comprehensive put out by any government, and are referenced 24/7 by NGOs and human rights defenders around the world. The scope of that is being stripped down to eliminate gender, diversity, LGBTQ concerns, and so forth. I could go on, I won't, but the impacts on labor rights standards and human rights more generally are at least disastrous and possibly potentially demonstrably catastrophic.
Okay, well,
Other
just
than
to,
that,
yeah, exactly.
Let me just add a couple of words to that. I mean, I think, let's not forget the, near complete withdrawal from the US in terms of international aid.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the areas I work in, media freedom and freedom of expression, about 40% of the global funding for that is estimated to come from the United States, and that just disappeared essentially overnight. And so, my own organization doesn't receive funding from the United States government, but a lot of our operations have been directly affected because we're collaborating with partners who depend on that support for their own operations, and now they haven't got that. So, I mean, I think that people talk a lot about the health impacts and the humanitarian, and those are all very, very important too. But the impact of the disappearance of the overnight disappearance of that funding from human rights activists around the world is very significant.
Diagnostically, what I think is going on though is we're recognizing that reliance on one particular superpower as the kind of the load-bearing beam for the entire international rule-based order as the West experiences it, and within the United States relying on one political party to do things, it's not working. It's not working. And so we have to come up with a new approach, which is an approach which is more distributed, and making it, if it's more distributed, then there's less capability for that load-bearing beam to be kicked out, and hence the entire house fall down. So the ideas of these sort of global coalitions is to move away from the reliance on a single actor. We're seeing what happens when we do that. And you are literally itemizing out individual examples of what happens when we do that. So there's an opportunity to remake the international order. And I would argue that due to advances in information technology, there's a capability to organize, to structure at the international level decision-making quite differently than what we inherited from the 20th century, which I would suggest was a good attempt. But we're in a new era with new dangers, very clearly, and that's going to take new ideas, and that's where this came in. So what I'm suggesting is it's going to take, for example, a single website that is a website where people can gather to talk about the boycotts that they're doing, how they're doing it, the effectiveness of them. That would be a start on the boycott idea. With respect to the idea of there being a statement with respect to the support for the rules-based order, absolutely, obviously, there would be a sentence added on to say that, and the actions in the United States by the current Trump administration are, completely undermining this, and that's why we're getting together, for sure. That would be added on. I was just cutting to the chase in terms of what we could all agree on. But all it takes is a website with that there. That's the start. That's the start. I would think that international NGOs like Transparency International, Amnesty, Greenpeace, etc., I'm just bringing up several that have a global platform that arguably all depend on the international rules-based order, perhaps joined by the International Chamber of Commerce and the IBA and other organizations could get together and say, we all stand behind the statement, and then have others join. That would be a start, a small start, not a panacea, a small start. Because if there is no opposition, then the steamrolling just keeps on going, which is what I see happening now. At any rate, thanks very much for basically socializing these ideas, to use a horrible academic expression. But I really appreciated your thoughts, and thanks as well to the many people who indicated their support for these ideas that have come in. They just said, we support, we support, we support.
Good.
They're not bothering asking you a question. So that's where this is coming from. So
Again, let me
hopefully
just say,
you
I
two will
just
join.
hope that you just take this draft forward and refine it and see if we can get a critical mass of credible individuals, or at least, or ideally institutions, to support this. It's a good first draft, and it's too important not to try to take forward urgent. So I hope
I endorse that too. You got to start somewhere. I mean, I sort of said, to get a proper campaign going, you need all of these things, and I think, but that's not where you start. You start somewhere, and that idea is a good kickoff, and hopefully that would build, because I do think that actual coordination, which goes beyond just endorsing a statement, would make the boycott side of things bite a little harder.
Excellent. Much appreciated, gentlemen. Hopefully something will happen that will resolve all our issues, making all of this unnecessary in the next day or two. I'm not counting on it.
No.
Anyway, thanks
Thank you.
and thanks to all of the people who patched in today.